Hi, welcome to this section. We're going to be talking about shape contrast, which isn't shape psychology or when and why to use certain shapes, but this is more a focus on the abstract idea itself. So, shape contrast is a part of shape design, and to me, is combining different types of shapes and forms to make a more unique result than the two alone. Usually, we have two opposing things to work with, things that are sharp and things that are soft. And we can also think of it in terms of primitives: circular or cylindrical, rectangular, triangular, boxes, hexagons, spheres, so on. Mixing different proportions, placements, shapes can allow us to make more unique end results. But let's also talk about how much. So to bring it back to our talk about hierarchy and evenness, it's very important to make sure that we use enough of the same types of shapes, that we have a primary shape language, but not so much so that it becomes hard to read and completely, for example, angular. We need to have some curviness to offset that angularity, or 70-30, or primary and secondaries, you could call it. Switch it up, because difference is contrast. If you have too many hard shapes, it's going to be too hard. Too much curviness, and it's going to look like a blob. To make things feel more pleasing and dynamic, we have to mix these together. Not only will it give you more unique results, but you're going to find your shapes and your forms looking a lot more pleasing. So now that we've talked a little bit about the theory, let's go into some contextual examples and start breaking down how to apply this and contextualize it. Alright, so I have Photoshop open. Let's break down some examples of shape and form contrast. So one of my favorite examples is this helmet and this head of this mech that Alex Fagini made. So basically, one thing that I really enjoy about this is that he mixes this subtle curve with this very angular, pyramidal front. And then he manages to throw in some spherical shapes and then also a circular shape. It's a very high contrast shape, but I think it's pretty interesting. I haven't seen someone mix this many types of shapes and forms, at least any time that I remember it. So I always found that this was a really interesting thing. If it was just a box or some really regular shape, I don't think it would be as cool. And so by mixing and combining different treatments of forms and edges and shape, we're getting a much more interesting result. So here's an example in composition, and I quite like this one. First of all, if we just look at, angular elements, more hard ones, and we looked at curved ones, let's just kind of break down where these are. And there, there's a lot of straight lines, but we'll notice that most of the straight lines are pointing downwards. And then the most direct ones are pointing towards the focal point. So we have some nice sharp lines. This whole part of the scene is pretty much a bit softer. We have a little bit more curves. We do have a few, hard edges, but it's very soft. But then, once we get over here, we start to have some shape contrast. We have this box shape, which isn't present anywhere else in the scene. So by just having this box shape alone, we're going to start drawing the eye. But then, we have a circular shape. And the circle is one of the most strong types of shapes that you can put into any design, and that's why I think it's very important that you're careful with how you use them. So, but by using shape contrast, he used the hard lines to guide the eye, and then he also is using the circular elements to be the source of attention, because it's different from anything else in the scene. I would even go as far to say, too, that by echoing these on the opposite side of the screen, which are curves, he's also going to be echoing them, here, which we'll talk about a little bit later with balance, but I think it's a pretty good example of shape contrast to guide the eye. This is another one of my favorite examples, and it's not just shapes, but it's also value and color, but a big part of it is shapes. So Sparth is using here basically shape contrast to separate the foreground and the background, and to force the viewer to be more attracted to this. By using a visual connection, which we covered, which is called echoing, he's made a connection between the foreground and the background by using the same color palette and more round shapes. But because these are such a different and contrasting shape to the rest of the environment, this becomes naturally an area of focus, regardless of its value. So I find that this is one of my favorite and most clear examples of shape contrast in use. So I see people trying to do Machine Krieger stuff all the time. And one of the things that I think a lot of people struggle with is the fact that the forms are so lumpy. I mean, everybody who's tried this probably has struggled with this. It's pretty simple as to why I think that they're pleasing, but also how to make your forms look correct. Besides understanding, you know, the volumes of the forms, for example, it's about how forms intersect and transition. You know, how they become soft and they also become hard. So for example, you'll notice that when certain shapes are transitioning, they soften out. And then where certain ones are meeting, they become nice and sharp. And we get this nice sharp line. And then it softens out. Shape contrast is super important for form because when you're dealing with lumpy forms, especially like this, those areas of sharpness is what's going to make everything feel much more correct. Instead of feeling like a lumpy blob, you now have this nice sharp line to contrast this very subtle and soft form changes. You know, here for example, we have a medium form change, and then we have this underlying form that it's connected to. And the transition is very soft. You can barely tell. Where, you know, here, for example, as I, you know, drew out, this is a very strong form change. I have a car example that you're going to see this in the real world in a little bit, but this is very important. So with that said, and on that same note, let's talk about that with organic sculpting. So I've been a huge fan of Kenneth Scott's art for a very long time. I think that he's got some really amazing forms, and I'm a huge fan of his form design. And there's a lot of things that I could break down in here and talk about, but one of my favorite things is just his contrast between softness and then hardness. You know, like this whole form is very bubbly and, you know, soft. But then by having these nice little tiny details and crispy bits, we start to make it feel a little bit nicer. It doesn't feel mushy as an accident. It feels a bit more tight and intentional. And I think that without these small, you know, contrasts, we're going to start having very lumpy forms. It's something that a lot of people who are sculpting will struggle with. You know, they struggle to have things all lumpy. And, you know, everyone, and including me, could be a lot better at it. But for example, like here, we have this nice sharp line and these nice soft forms. There's usually some sort of contrasting soft areas with sharp lines. So this is something that I think a lot of people struggle with in organics. And there's more things that I think that when it comes to form design, people struggle with, but we'll save that for another lesson. So let's go to a fire hydrant, which is a little bit more of a real world object. And I'll just break down some of the types of shapes in here and why I think that, you know, it's funny, I was walking, I was like, wow, this is a perfect example because we have so many types of shapes and we're mixing so many. Like we have, for example, this circular shape that this boxy form has to transition into. It's very high contrast, very interesting. You know, we start breaking up the bevels even too. So we get a very different type of treatment to how the edges are hit and the highlights are. We have these nice soft transitions contrasted by these very sharp curves or very sharp angles. And then additionally, the main body of it is more of like, you know, a chamfered box, and the base and the top are both circular. And we have circular parts and then hexagonal parts. So I just thought that this was an interesting design. It has a lot of variety of shape, and I think it's pretty interesting and high contrast as a result. All right, so something that I wanted to talk about that's pretty dear to me, people who do game art, and since I know a lot of people who are going to be buying this tutorial do 3D, a lot of times in game art, and just in 3D in general, people don't pay attention to subtle bevels and like finessing their forms and their transitions. I think that this is super important, and I put a lot of work and effort into it. So for example, a lot of times what you see in game art, and not that I do game art, so it's a little bit of a hard comparison, but here's like something I made when I was at about 7 months of 3D. So this is like many years old. One thing that a lot of people end up doing is they will make all of their edges the same hardness, or just like a a bevel. Those put some edge loops and call it a day. And they bevel everything. There's no thought as to form. There's no thought as to the bevels and the transitions. There's none of that at all. And I think that as people become more experienced 3D artists, they stop doing this as much. But I really wanted to point it out and impress upon anyone watching this who does 3D. Really learn how to finesse your surfaces. Try and put some more love into your bevels. Like, bevels are, especially in hard surface, which is, I'm assuming most of the people watching this, or a lot of them, like, bevels are so important. So for example, I intentionally had, sorry, let me find my layer. I intentionally had this edges much more crispy and this one much more soft. This is all very intentional because I wanted to have contrast between the two. If they were all hard, which I could do, it's not going to look very nice. So for example, I have a hard edge here, but I have a nice soft bevels here to contrast it. So that hard edge doesn't seem so hard anymore. Same thing here. I'm trying to fade things and focus on how the light is going to hit it. It's not rocket science. Just really finesse your bevels. And to me, this is an example of shape contrast because we're contrasting hard angles with soft transitions. I think that this is a really good way to try and approach things. Don't make things all hard edge. And yeah, that's something I see a lot in 3D, and I just kind of wanted to rant about it a little bit. And I think that'll hopefully help some people who are trying to get better at modeling and make their models more interesting. So, all right, this is my last example. I took this picture of a car, and I just wanted to talk about basically what I was saying on my model with bevels and with Kenneth and Kao Yokoyama, or however you say. Sorry if I said that wrong. Their art is basically the idea of soft and hard. So one thing that you'll see and notice a lot in car designs is that we have this very, very strong use of contrast between soft and hard. In fact, car designers are masters of this. You'll notice that even the way that they transition forms, this line, for example, that's so strong, instead of making an ugly point or a tangent, they fade the form off. I'm not a huge fan of how this particular one was done, but I think it's a great example to start seeing how you can finesse your forms and think about how they interact, and also what parts are, harder and what aren't. Let me break this door down a little bit more. So here we have a nearly planar piece with a hard edge. So we can see right here that there's contrast. But if we look closely at the shading, we'll notice that then we contrast it with this very subtle curve. You'll see that this whole form is actually a curve, inward and outward. So they've contrasted this more sharp and less curved shape with a more curved one. Then to contrast it again, we have another hard line. You can see this pattern in a lot of different places on car designs, where things are faded and become sharp again. It's very important to think about this, not just when you're making a car, but when you're making a mech, when you're sculpting an alien, when you're painting a picture, or you're designing a head. There's a lot of ways that we can use shape contrast to make very interesting and pleasing images. So I suggest that you go and look for different ways that you can think about this and apply the things that I've talked about in the different examples. I think that now you should hopefully have a basis to start seeing this in the world and hopefully applying it. So with that said, I'll see you guys in the next lesson.